Hi, welcome to the Standing Rock Dakota Access Pipeline Primer for White People. My name is Pam Tinker, and I have created this YouTube for you to explain what is happening at the Standing Rock, North Dakota and Dakota Access Pipeline protest site. Since the national media has decided not to cover this issue, I decided to research it and create this primer for people to learn about the issues and why this is so important. Because despite the paucity of coverage, thousands of people from all over the country, including veterans, celebrities, and environmental organizations, and over 300 indigenous tribes and nations have come to stand with the Lakota people of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. My intention is to provide a synopsis of the main issues so that you don't have to spend the days that I just spent in researching. I am a Cherokee citizen. I am not Lakota, and I do not speak for the Lakota. I am not a legal or government expert or an historian. I welcome any corrections if my understanding is incorrect or incomplete. I am a practicing physical therapist and the founder and president of a nonprofit nature-based early childhood program. So I have a science background, and I have spent my life bringing the young ones forward to have a connection and love for Mother Earth. I come from ancestors of Cherokee, Irish, English, and Scott descent, so I have been raised to see many angles and viewpoints. My recent master's degree concentrated on religion, culture, and values, including a thesis that involved delving into my Cherokee history. This gave me some understanding of the complexity of the history of relations between Anglos and the indigenous nations of North America. The story has been a repeating one with variations on a theme. The leaders of Standing Rock are very busy. This is my offering in the form of a primer on the topics surrounding and leading up to this historic movement to assist those who are unfamiliar. This is my way to stand with Standing Rock. In my mind, this movement is as monumental as when Rosa Parks decided not to give up her seat on the bus. Just as that was not about the one incident, but was about a breaking point. Standing Rock is the breaking point beyond which thousands of people are not willing to go. I have divided the issues into categories, starting with distinct concrete issues and ending with what I believe is the main point and the reason for the global interest and support for Standing Rock that has to do with competing worldviews. At the conclusion, I list YouTube resources that allow you to hear directly from the Lakota official representatives. The categories I cover are how the pipeline came to be, the environmental concerns, health issues of those who live in spill locations, past history and the record of pipelines, history of the land and who owns it, cultural, sacred, and religious land desecration, police brutality and human rights violations, and finally the cultural worldview differences. Our first topic is how the pipeline came to be. The Dakota Access Pipeline is a 1,170-mile-long pipeline that took the risk of beginning construction prior to receiving permits for the full course of its proposed path. The remaining segment of the pipeline is planned to be bored under the Oahe Reservoir that is part of the Missouri River and is considered federal land that requires a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers and approval by Congress. The pipeline has received permits through a process called Nationwide Permit 12 so far, and that is a process that was created to expedite small projects on less than an acre, such as building a boat dock. This process was created to spare small projects from going through all of the red tape that is required of larger projects. This permitting process was not intended for a project of this magnitude that crosses 200 water tributaries in 4 states. There are many questions regarding why this project was permitted as a series of small projects through 4 states. For example, was it to circumvent a more thorough permitting process? Local citizens' protests regarding the pipeline were made in all of the 4 states. There are questions on why the states and the Army Corps of Engineers allowed the permitting process to proceed under this act. This type of permitting process did not require environmental impact studies that look at the potential dangers to human populations. Under the nationwide Permit 12 process, they were only required to do a series of local environmental assessments. These are less stringent reports that look at the local environmental situation and do not take human impact into consideration. In the scant news coverage, the fact that the Missouri River serves as the drinking water source for millions of people downstream from the proposed pipeline, in addition to the Standing Rock Reservation, is rarely mentioned. It is rarely mentioned that the pipeline crosses multiple streams, rivers, and tributaries. Sometimes reported is that the pipeline was proposed to cross upstream from Bismarck, North Dakota, but was rerouted downstream from Bismarck and upstream within a mile of the Standing Rock Reservation after the Army Corps of Engineers evaluated the Bismarck route and concluded it was not a viable option for many reasons. One reason mentioned in the agency's environmental assessment is the proximity to wellhead source water protection areas that are to be avoided to protect municipal water supplies. It was deemed too risky to the local residents and their water source. It was considered by federal pipeline regulators as a high-consequence area. In addition, the chosen shorter route through Sioux Treaty Land avoided exposure to additional water tributaries, an indication that there is legitimate concern for leaks. Further investigation on the campaign contributions that were made by pipeline entities to officials in all states and the investments that these people may hold in the pipeline is needed, but is outside of the scope of my report. Also, further study is warranted in investigating the relationship and legality of the easements that were granted by the Iowa Utilities Board that allowed the use of their easements under eminent domain through a stretch of private land parcels against the will of landowners in Iowa, where owners of 17 land parcels sued. I am also very curious about the big oil or political ties with the Army Corps of Engineers that would cause them to fast-track permits in this piecemeal manner that was meant for small projects under an acre and was obviously not a process that was intended for a project of this size and which allowed avoidance of a proper environmental impact study. Under environmental concerns, there are environmental concerns regarding the safety and security issue of a pipeline crossing the Missouri River and about 200 tributaries that supply water for farm irrigation, wildlife habitat, and drinking water for 17 million people downstream. Many of the people and environmental organizations who are allies standing with the Lakota people feel that the continued investment in carbon-based energy is endangering the future health and well-being of our children and grandchildren, and the health and viability of our planet. They feel that the government and the corporate world have failed to provide leadership that will shift investment to clean, renewable energy. The blocking of new pipeline infrastructure investment is deemed as a major responsibility of citizens in order to protect the future of our planet. Under health issues, in areas where pipeline leaks, spills, or explosions have taken place, the safety of drinking water, the air, livestock, fish, wildlife, and crops is endangered. There are reports of increased rates of cancer, asthma, tumors, serious skin disorders, and neurological disorders in humans and in animals. These long-term damages to well-being are unfairly shouldered by citizens, local government, healthcare providers, and health insurance companies rather than the corporation that is making great profit for its stockholders. Unless they are brought to task to pay for the public expense of their operation, the quick money will continue to draw them to carbon-based investments rather than turning their efforts towards safer and sustainable energy sources. Past history and the record of pipelines. From the reports that I have studied, pipeline companies do not have good safety records, and when spills and explosions occur, they do not have a good record of cleanup and do not adequately reimburse people and communities whose land, health, and property values have been damaged. Between January 2010 and May 2015, more than 168,000 barrels of oil were spilled. That is more than 7 million gallons. Over 1,000 crude oil pipeline leaks and ruptures were reported to the Federal Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration during that period. It is frequently the taxpayers and individual citizens who are left to deal with the repercussions of an incident that requires remediation. Many of the existing pipelines are old and are poorly maintained. Maintenance is an expense, but new pipelines are money makers for the banks, investment firms, and the oil and pipe corporations. These companies include Energy Transfers Equity, trading as ETE on the New York Stock Exchange, Sunoco LP, SUN, Energy Transfer Partners, trading as NTP, Sunoco Logistics Partners, LP, that's SXL, Dakota Access, LLC, Enbridge, Wells Fargo, Citibank, SunTrust, and many other banks and firms in the United States and around the globe. The history of the land and who owns it. Beginning shortly after the War of Independence, the United States government initiated a long series of interactions with the indigenous people of the continent that grabbed land and resources and broke treaties and promises. This was true of the Lakota U.S. government interactions, beginning with the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, that was created by the Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which provided for survey and settlement of lands that the 13 colonies ceded to the federal government after the War of Independence, much of which was land stolen from Indian nations. After spending hours attempting to summarize the many infractions that have occurred against the Lakota people, I decided to cite the highlights and leave deeper study to those who are inclined to dig deeper. Unfortunately, the many brutal attacks and treaty infractions are so numerous I was unable to summarize them in a space that would work within this YouTube time frame. The North Dakota State Government website has a helpful timeline of the historical events that occurred in that state. See the History and Culture of the Standing Rock Oyate, Standing Rock Timeline, nd.gov. I would like to say regarding the history of the land is that the generational trauma that has been inflicted upon these people explains the depth of determination and sense of responsibility of the Standing Rock Sioux to stand for their rights at this point in time. They have had their land rights reduced repeatedly by the United States government. At this point, they have been backed into a corner and can only move forward. They have no reason, based on past history, to believe that their sovereign rights will be upheld at this time. Some of the important events that I recommend that you read about more include the 1851 and 1868 Fort Laramie treaties, the 1863 Whitestone Hill Battle or Massacre, depending on your viewpoint. Here, Lakota families, who were the ancestors of the Standing Rock people, at a hunting encampment were massacred. They were possibly mistaken for hostile warrior groups that the Army was pursuing. In addition to the massacre of babies, children, women, and men, the destruction included 300 teepees and 400,000 to 500,000 pounds of dried buffalo meat, the winter supplies for the people, and the product of 1,000 butchered buffalo. The 1874 illegal invasion of the Black Hills is another topic. This was an invasion into sovereign Lakota land by General Custer and a group of geologists to determine the extent of gold in the region. This was followed by the gold rush on Lakota land caused by the leak of information regarding gold in this region. The United States, failing to honor the 1851 treaty, allowed miners to sweep through the Lakota land to extract their gold resources and allowed yet another illegal loss of Lakota land, which is still being contested. The Dawes or Allotment Act. This act established the Standing Rock Sioux as a reservation on March 2, 1889. This reduced the land holdings of the Great Sioux Nation by taking the Sioux Treaty lands and dividing it up into plots of land for individual Sioux people to own. This is in conflict with the communal culture of the shared land. After parceling the plots to individuals, there was unassigned land that was stolen. This Non-allotted land was open to settlement by non-Indian people. Most of their good farmland was lost. The settlement of whites in a checkerboard fashion within the Lakota Sioux boundaries caused jurisdictional confusion and conflict. Some of the confusion today involves dispute over what is defined as Lakota Sioux land. Since this land grab occurred through coercion and resulted in Standing Rock Treaty land being issued to whites within the Lakota boundaries, does the United States have the moral or legal right to evict Lakota people from standing to protect their ancestral land from desecration and pollution? And the main point of the history that I'd like to make is how the Missouri River land was stolen from the Standing Rock Sioux and turned into a reservoir that is where the DAPL is proposed to cross. The Oahe Reservoir Project was authorized by the Flood Control Act that was approved on December 22, 1944, Public Law 534, 78th Congress, Second Session, as a part of a system of multi-purpose reservoirs on the Missouri River for flood control, irrigation, navigation, power, and other purposes. The Sloan-Pickering Plan created the Missouri Basin Interagency Committee in 1945 to coordinate the work of various agencies. The 28 reservations that would take the brunt of the land loss and the flooding to create the reservoirs were not consulted and were not included in the Interagency Committee. They were informed of their fate, decided without their input, 3 years after the approval of the project. The Oahe Dam inundated the prime bottomlands, forests, and gardens that sustained the families in the wintertime. Standing Rock lost over 55,000 acres of their most productive land, causing great long-term loss in income and economic security. For a detailed historical account, I studied a PhD dissertation by Harriet Skye in Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, completed in the fall of 2007, entitled Mininatakapi, the Oahe Dam and the Standing Rock People, 19,000 to 1960. Since the Oahe Dam, reservoir, and power plant were created without the consultation of the Lakota people and the land was confiscated from them against their will and without their input, does DAPL or the North Dakota government have the right to evict Lakota people from protecting this space? Once the dam was completed and it became evident that the government had taken land in excess of what was required for the dam, should the U.S. government have deeded back all excess lands that had been taken from them? In my mind, that is the only moral and ethical action to take. In addition, the Lakota people should have unfettered access to the reservoir and have unfettered fishing and hunting rights in this region, and the water should not be endangered by pipeline crossings that threaten the safety of the water, fish, and wildlife of the area. In 1968, the Environmental Protection Act was approved, and later, 5 years later, the Endangered Species Act. The Environmental Protection Act stipulates that all federal actions required an environmental impact statement. The statutes of the Endangered Species Act is also federal law. There are questions raised regarding why these acts were not upheld properly in reviews of the federal action on the crossing of the Missouri River federal lands. Why did they not perform the EIS as required by law, and were the Endangered Species Act protocols performed correctly? In the 1970s, President Nixon signed the Indian Self-Determination Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and the Health Care Improvement Act. The relationship between the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the tribes has evolved since 1806 from dominance and control to advice and assistance. It is my hope that the BIA will help to guide the United States government to pursue all future actions in relating to the sovereign indigenous nations in a legally, morally, and ethically sound manner. And the next topic is cultural, sacred, and religious land desecration. The desecration of land of important cultural, sacred, and religious significance begins to get our final discussion on on worldview differences. In my lifelong observations of the Anglo world and the dominant culture's value system, my observation is that there is a cultural blindness that prevents many whites from seeing and honoring what sustains them. Land that is in its natural state appears to them to be vacant and waiting to be exploited. The common investment and real estate terms illustrate this. In assessing property, if the land has not been disrupted by human activity, it is termed to be unimproved. The concept is that when white people come in and destroy the natural world, they are improving the land. It seems to me that part of the misunderstanding between the two entities is that burial grounds on Lakota land do not look like white people's cemeteries. They do not have fences around them, and they do not have headstones in neat lines with information engraved into each gravestone. In many cases, the graves are mass burial grounds where massacres took place, causing the survivors to flee for their lives. This situation is not conducive to neat and tidy cemeteries. Ceremonial grounds and religious spaces are not designated by church buildings. Cultural sites are not designated as parks or museums. Sacred and religious space for the indigenous culture is natural space where ceremonies, prayers, vision quests, and the honoring of ancestors and those lost in massacres and major battles takes place. They are places that are woven into the oral history, mythology, and ancestral connections of the culture that do not require improvements to be sacred. This does not fit into the white concept of material structures that are placed on land to signify such things. The Lakota sacred sites are missing the improvements, such as churches, cemeteries, museums, archives, libraries, and battleground public park centers with information booths, plaques, and tours about that the white society expects to see if a space is significant. The next topic is police brutality and human rights violations. The United States Commission on Civil Rights is investigating law enforcement for using military-style equipment and excessive force against Native American protesters, finally. The Lakota people and their allies, together referred to as the Water Protectors, are unarmed and are committed to nonviolence, prayer, and nonviolent direct actions to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline, known as DAPL. They have been camping in the area near the path of DAPL since April. This prayerful unarmed movement has been met with escalating militarized police actions, including surveillance by helicopters, planes, and drones, and the use of internet jammers, water cannons in sub-freezing weather, pepper spray, mace, concussion grenades, plastic bullets, and shotgun beanbags. People have been arrested, stripped, searched, and held in what has been described as dog kennels. More than 20 people have required hospital services, and over 300 have been injured and treated by medics on site. Reporters and celebrities have been arrested and harassed, including the arrest of Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! The lack of national media coverage on human rights violations of this magnitude is totally unacceptable. As the militarized police, who are being paid by taxpayer dollars, and Tiger Swan mercenary security force paid by the Dakota Access are protecting the interests of big oil, the supporters for the Water Protectors continues to grow, and the support for the Water Protectors continues to grow with celebrity appearances by folks including Jane Fonda and Shailene Woodley, fundraising including concerts by Jackson Browne, Bonnie Raitt at Standing Rock, and the Dave Matthews and Graham Nash in D.C., and the support of more than 1,000 veterans who have committed to act as human shields to protect the Water Protectors' right to free speech as they demonstrate and pray. Letters have been written to the Justice Department and President Obama regarding the human rights violations, requesting their assistance. Legal suits have been filed. Marches and demonstrations have taken place in 300 cities throughout the United States. Meanwhile, DAPL continued construction on the pipeline, even though they had been requested to voluntarily halt pending further assessment by the Army Corps of Engineers. That is the agency that will decide whether a permit is approved for them to bore under the Missouri River. If the Army Corps approves the permit, their permit will be required approval by Congress due to the change of use of a federal project to include a pipeline. The final segment is cultural worldview differences. So as you can see, this is a complex issue involving sovereign rights and treaty rights of the Standing Rock Sioux people, and environmental protection rights, human rights, legal rights, and historical, cultural, and religious rights. The standoff at Standing Rock appears to be a turning point in history where we decide if our population is going to be ruled by law and respect for human and environmental justice, or if we are going to be ruled by big oil and other corporate interests that look out for their own self-interest and the financial gains of their investors over the health and welfare of our planet and its inhabitants. As stated so well by Buddhist scholar Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi in an article published by Common Dreams on November 18, 2016, those arrayed against the pipeline, the Native Americans and their allies, hold a different worldview that entails a different set of priorities. This is a worldview that esteems life values over market values. It is a worldview that understands water is a source of life, an irreplaceable substance far more essential than petroleum. It recognizes that with sufficient funding and political will, we can obtain all the energy we need from the sun and wind and geothermal sources, and it sees the ideal relationship of humankind to the earth to be one of care, stewardship, and reverence rather than reckless exploitation. Wado.